She was a beloved horse trainer, looking forward to the next phase of her career.
She was a kind and gentle woman who'd been devoted to horses all of her life.
She had got to this point in her life where actually everything should have been plain sailing.
But her retirement plans were cut short by a vicious attack.
There was heavy blood staining to the floor, blood staining to the walls.
It just looks like something from a horror movie.
It was a disturbing case that would take investigators into the mind of a killer driven by hatred and revenge.
All of that rage, all of that anger had burst out a big cathartic explosion.
July 15th, 2016. It's late Friday afternoon near the sleepy village of Seaton in northern England. Local farmer Sam Southwell is just finishing his chores for the day when he notices that his sister, 60-year-old Fiona Southwell, hasn't returned home from work.
Fiona was employed as a stable hand at a place called Grange Farm. Now, Sam started to get worried because it wasn't like her to be late.
It was around the afternoon time, and usually she would have come back to the farm where they lived. I think it was only about a mile, if that, away. He just starts to say something must be wrong. So he jumps in his Land Rover and he goes to the farm.
When Sam gets there, the farm's owner tells him that he isn't sure where Fiona is.
He'd seen her tending the horses earlier. He thought she'd left for the day. If she was going to be anywhere, she was going to be in the barn. Sam makes his way past the stables, about 15 meters towards the end of the barn, and it's there he stumbles upon this horrifying scene.
It just looks like something from a horror movie. There's blood splattered up the walls. There is just blood everywhere.
On the floor of the barn is his sister, Fiona.
She was lying on her back in a corner near a wheelbarrow in a pool of blood. It was obviously a very violent scene.
She couldn't be resuscitated. He was aware just from looking at Fiona that she was dead.
It's terrifying on a number of levels. I mean, who does something like this to a 60-year-old woman?
Ever since she was a little girl, Fiona Southwell spent most of her time around horses.
She had her first pony at the age of 1.5 and never lost that passion.
So the goals that other people may have, big houses, fast cars, didn't interest Fiona at all.
As she grew older, Fiona would turn that calling into a successful career.
She rode competitively in shows. She'd also taken part in a pageant for the Queen's Silver Jubilee. She also suffered a number of injuries horse riding, so then she became a riding instructor.
She was really highly respected within equestrian circles. She was a judge at county shows and things like that.
When her riding days were over, Fiona moved on to other pursuits, but she'd never strayed far from her first love.
Horses were an integral part of her life, which is why she'd taken the job at Grange Farm. But she was also making plans for the future.
At the age of 60, she was planning what would have been quite a big move out of the area, down to the south of England, where she would have had equestrian facilities.
Fiona had a lifelong friend, Brian. He had bought some land in the south of the country and had invited her to come and have a new chapter, as you would describe, in her life and go to live with Brian and his partner to look after their horses.
Now, Fiona has been brutally murdered, and local police want to know who's responsible.
You build these thoughts on the way to a scene. What might be my possible scenarios? And so, whilst it was initially reported that this could be a homicide or a murder, equally I was thinking, is this an industrial accident? Has there been an accident with the horses? Has she been kicked? Or has she injured herself in some way by accident? Or is it suicide? And they're all the scenarios that present themselves. And what's absolutely essential as an investigator is to keep an open mind, despite what feelings and bias you may naturally lean towards, just so that you keep your options open. I got to the scene and was greeted by uniformed colleagues who'd cordoned, preserving the evidence that was there. On approaching Fiona's body within the stabling area, it was abundantly clear very quickly that this was a murder. The level of violence used in the attack was particularly sustained and violent. There were significant stab wounds.
Fiona was found to have 19 different stab wounds to her head and body. The force used was extremely violent.
The first thing they have to do is secure the crime scene, which is no easy task considering where they are.
I'm faced with what is a significant scene to manage because the farm was quite large and we're in a rural location with many routes of egress from the scene for the offender.
As forensic specialists began collecting evidence, detectives interview the farm's other employees.
There were several people in and around the farm at that time, and that had been during that day.
The last time anyone had seen Fiona was around 9:30 in the morning when she'd put the horses out to field. The tenant farmer told the police that she was a relatively new hire, but she seemed to get along fine with everyone.
They didn't know whether it was a burglary, a theft, and Fiona's kind of caught them. There was just so much confusion. But because of the way that she was found and she was slain, it was pointing towards a bit more than just, the average theft or burglary gone wrong.
After more than 8 hours of investigation, police are left in the dark, in more ways than one.
We'd lost daylight, it was dark in that barn. We needed to bring in specialist scientific advisors to give us the best chance of understanding exactly what had happened. And so that decision at that time was that the scene would be secured, that Fiona would be remaining where she was until the next morning where we could do more work.
As the small seaside town sleeps, investigators wait for the necessary equipment and experts to arrive, and a killer remains at large.
They posted guards to watch over the body, but detectives were still concerned because somewhere out there was a killer.
Are the officers on that scene guard at risk? Is somebody within the curtilage of the farm hiding? Within stackyards, barns, outbuildings, all the things that all farms have? Disturbing, really, to think that somebody's out there right now. This has not been done very long, and is anybody else at risk from that person?
Coming up, daylight reveals the full extent of this vicious attack.
It became increasingly concerning that an attack such as this, is it somebody with a grievance or is it a stranger?
On the morning of July 16th, 2016, detectives in northern England returned to the barn where 60-year-old Fiona Southwell was found brutally murdered.
It was obviously a very extreme incident.
The investigators and detectives walking up to that small farm in Seaton, it was just, I think it was probably unthinkable what would be going through their mind.
It was an incredibly hot weekend. Summer, sun was burning, blisteringly hot weather, and it felt very different than it had the night before and during the hours of darkness.
And the small seaside town has woken to the news that there is a killer on the loose.
Straight away, the national press, the international press were all over the story because an idyllic farm in East Yorkshire, it's horrible. A woman slain, a tiny little old lady basically slain in a barn doing a job that she loved.
We think about, how does this feel to be in this community? Knowing this has happened, how would I feel? We were doing everything that we needed to do to make them safe and to feel safe.
Detective Tony Cockrell leads the investigation.
I reattended the scene with our forensic scientists and scenes of crime officers to go and reassess where we were, see where Fiona was again, and see what the interpretation of that scene meant to us in the daylight so we could see clearly exactly as to what had happened.
It was much, much worse in the light of day. Examining the body, they discovered that she'd been stabbed several times. And although Fiona was a small woman, it was clear that she had fought really hard for her life.
She had those stab wounds throughout her body and arms, and the attack was really brutal. 19 in total, including injuries to her hands and forearms, indicating to me that she had tried to defend herself in some way during the attack. What we would call defence injuries.
The ferocity of the attack is really telling. It's up close, it's personal, it takes a lot of time and strength and effort to do that. This is somebody who was engaged in a frenzy of overkill, who was really getting out all of that passionate anger.
Fiona's body is transported to a mortuary where a pathologist will conduct an autopsy. In the meantime, police continue to gather evidence.
Forensic experts are combing through the site itself, while detectives are canvassing the surrounding area looking for witnesses.
Within urbanised areas, it's easier because there are lots of people to go and speak to. However, in this rural setting, in a community of farms that were outlying, it's very difficult.
No one saw or heard anything, so they talked to the family to find out if anyone had it out for Fiona, maybe an angry ex-boyfriend or something like that.
It came across very strange. An elderly woman in her 60s who tends to horses would be found in such a way you didn't know whether Fiona got romantically involved with someone and then it's turned into, something a bit more than just a killing, a murder.
According to Fiona's loved ones, she wasn't the kind of person who had enemies.
She wasn't in a relationship. She didn't have people that she had fallen out with. There was absolutely no suggestion whatsoever that she had enemies to fall out with or anybody who would have such grievance against her.
Her family described her as this wonderful, kind woman who wouldn't hurt a fly.
Fiona's brother Sam took it particularly hard, especially as he was the one who found Fiona's body.
It was just obviously distraught. It was a sense of just an unbelievable thing had happened to him. He was just also lost for words. He just couldn't believe it. He just had no clue, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking for him.
Unable to narrow their search, investigators work with Fiona's family to make a list of all the people in her life.
That list grew as the more people that we speak to would give us more information. And we would deploy teams of investigators to speak to these people and to glean what information that we could to build up very quickly a picture of her life.
They're looking for any kind of lead or possible motive, but unfortunately, no one jumped out as a potential suspect.
The people around Fiona were all consistently shocked at what had happened to her, and significantly, no one was presenting themselves at that time to me as the senior investigating officer as a person of interest.
So investigators return to the scene of the crime.
They go back to retrace the killer's steps to work out how he might have gotten in and where he went afterwards.
The police had taped off the entire perimeter of the farm, even the lanes around it.
It gave us an opportunity to look around the farm, create a map of the area so that we understood the routes of egress that an offender may have taken.
It doesn't take long for them to come up with a possible lead.
The most obvious route was up the side of a field, leaving from the barn and led to an old disused railway track, which led all the way, if you walked down the length of that track, back into the town. And I set about our trained search officers looking down the side of the field towards the track.
Coming up, detectives finally make a breakthrough.
They came back quite excitedly, having had what I would call a significant find.
It has been 18 hours since Fiona Southwell was found stabbed to death in the stables where she worked, and police are no closer to finding her killer.
Although no one seemed to have any idea who might have done it, the nature of the crime was a clue in and of itself.
The level of violence that was used to kill Fiona suggested there was something personal behind it.
It's very, very personal to stab somebody, and stab somebody multiple times in the face and in the upper chest area.
However, Further examination of the surrounding area has given detectives an idea where her attacker might have gone.
There was an old railway track that cut through the area, and investigators thought that this might be the escape route for the killer.
The railway track went past the farm where Fiona had died, and it was very popular with cyclists and walkers.
A team of officers have been sent to follow the tracks, and just minutes into their search, they come across two significant pieces of evidence.
In a hedgerow, about chest height, was a garment, a white but dirty garment. This was a white child's vest. The vest had what appeared to be blood upon it. It would appear that somebody had used the vest to place something inside the vest with blood upon it and draw it to clean it.
Not only that, but the officers had found what appeared to be the murder weapon.
There was a black-handled kitchen knife, which appeared to have been wiped, was found in some undergrowth nearby.
The knife with blood upon it, and that blood looked fresh and was a really significant find for us.
Investigators believe the killer discarded both items as they fled the scene.
It had been thrown, as somebody's leaving, thrown outwards towards the left onto a bush. If my theory was right, that somebody had held the vest and drawn the knife through it to clean it, there was a significant possibility of the user's DNA on that vest as well as the blood of the victim. That would be gold.
As detectives canvass the area, they come across another farm near the crime scene.
Lots of people were spoken to around neighbouring farms and neighbouring premises. And one of those was a small farm with horses, a place called Max Home. It was only a couple of fields away as the crow flies.
Max Home Farm was a family-owned operation located near the abandoned railway.
Investigators decide to stop by and pay a visit.
They hadn't witnessed anything out of the ordinary, but in the course of the conversation, detectives learned that the family had recently hired a new farmhand, a 21-year-old man named Daniel Edwards.
Daniel Edwards was working on an ad hoc, cash-in-hand basis at a farm. He would go there most mornings on foot. He'd walk there, and as the family were getting ready for school and work, he might have a cup of tea with them, and then he would go and look after their horses, and at some point after a couple of hours, he would then go home. And in payment for that, he would get a few pounds in cash.
However, the owners didn't think that Daniel had anything to do with it. It turned out that Daniel was a bit slow. He had something like a learning disability.
But later that evening, when detectives compare notes, Daniel's name pops up again.
Listening to the officers during the evening briefing, Daniel Edwards was mentioned more than once. And as we looked at who he was, his relationship to Fiona and her life, he was suddenly, very quickly in the spotlight as a person of interest to me.
2 months earlier, he'd worked at Grange Farm, which was his first job with horses, but he was sacked because of poor timekeeping.
He had been dismissed from that post by the lady who owned the horses because he was unreliable, in essence, and his work wasn't as good as she needed. So he had then found employment at a nearby farm, Max Home, where he carried out the same role.
After Daniel Edwards lost his job as a stable hand at Grange Farm, he was replaced by Fiona Southwell, who was much more experienced, much more reliable. The contrast couldn't have been greater.
Unfortunately for Daniel, the move had also meant a significant cut in pay, and he appeared to blame Fiona.
He was paid £80 a week at Grange Farm and only £10 or £20 a week at Max Home Farm.
Word around the farm was Daniel hadn't taken it very well. As far as he was concerned, Fiona had stolen his job.
He had harboured a grudge against Fiona for her replacing him. He had been sacked. He was unhappy about that. There had been a verbal confrontation with Fiona at some point.
Daniel appears to not only have a motive to kill Fiona, but the opportunity as well.
People at Max Home Farm had confirmed that Daniel Edwards was in fact in the area of Grange Farm and Max Home at the relevant time on the morning of Friday the 15th. And that relevant time was between 8:30 and 9:30 in the morning. when we believe the last sighting of Fiona alive was by the farmer of Grange Farm.
Since Daniel had worked at both farms, it made sense that he knew the area like the back of his hand, including the abandoned railway tracks where they had recovered the murder weapon.
He knew all the cut-throughs and he knew all the shortcuts, and suddenly he presented himself as a clear suspect for the murder of Fiona Southwell.
Coming up, a routine search turns up alarming new evidence.
We found clothing which, to the naked eye, had blood upon the hems of the jeans.
Less than 2 days into the investigation of 60-year-old Fiona Southwell's murder, Humberside police have a clear suspect. A 21-year-old stable hand named Daniel Edwards.
From their inquiries, police very quickly identified Daniel Edwards as a suspect and wanted to speak to him as a matter of urgency.
On July 16th, detectives make their move.
Daniel Edwards lived with his stepmother, father and two brothers at King Street in Hornsey, a short walk away from both farms.
Officers were let in by his father after banging on the door. And Daniel Edwards presented himself at the top of the stairs, and one of the detectives within the team arrested him on suspicion of murder. No, he did not resist arrest at all, and interestingly, didn't even ask any questions about why he was being arrested.
While Daniel is brought in for questioning, investigators conduct a search of the home.
Within his bedroom, we found clothing which, to the naked eye, had blood upon the hems of the jeans. So he had his clothing seized from him that he was wearing, and certain forensic examinations of him were carried out. Scenes of crime officer noted that there was staining around his ankles, which seemed to be peculiar. And a swab of those ankles of Daniel Edwards revealed a presumptive positive test for blood.
If the blood matches Fiona's, they have him dead to rights.
The blood samples are immediately sent to a crime lab for further testing. And while police wait for results, Daniel has some explaining to do.
Daniel Edwards was interviewed by an experienced homicide detective. He was interviewed around his movements and to establish his account of events on the day of the murder of Fiona Southwell and the next day.
Daniel appeared to be willing to cooperate at first. He took them on the route that he said he'd taken, but he claimed that went nowhere near the abandoned railway track.
That's all he said, that he'd just gone and done his work and walked home again.
He didn't come across as a criminal mastermind, to say the least. And when police started digging into his background, they found out why.
We found that he had struggled a bit through school. He wasn't an academic type of individual. He wasn't particularly very good at studying. He had had a fairly low IQ.
He had a mild learning disability, an IQ of 69, so just under what you need for a diagnosis of learning disability, and clearly that impacted on him.
He shied away from large groups and liked to keep himself basically within his own head, and was a bit of a loner.
He was a lad whose mother had left him at a very young age, and he was brought up predominantly by his father and stepmother.
As a teenager, Daniel began to act out, which led to problems at home.
Edwards was kicked out of home on occasions, and he bounced back and forth between home and other types of guest accommodation.
Daniel stayed with us back in 2012, and he's quite a quiet lad. He didn't ever say a great deal. He used to cycle to work in Hornsey every day in all weathers. He was working at some sort of tyre reclamation yard. He used to come back filthy.
Daniel's hosts tell police that he soon began taking advantage of their generosity.
At the time, we had direct dial telephones in all the rooms. We suddenly got a bill for £200, and what we realised was Daniel was phoning these sex chat lines and that sort of thing. So he's taking more and more liberties the longer he was here. In fact, we started to lock almost every door in the building because he's getting up to all sorts of shenanigans.
Daniel kept getting into trouble. He kept breaking house rules. He seemed oblivious as to what constituted acceptable behaviour.
One morning at breakfast, I remember saying to him, Daniel, do you know the difference between right and wrong? Because I told him off so many times, and he said, well, he did, but I got the impression he didn't really.
After only 3 months, Daniel had been asked to leave.
He ended up back at home, but he was still clearly struggling to find a purpose in life.
It was not clear how Daniel Edwards came to be working with horses, but as time went past, he did develop an enjoyment for it.
And that seemed to be, from what we could find out about him, the only kind of interest that he had in life at all.
When he wasn't taking care of horses, Daniel could be usually found loitering on the streets of Hornsey.
He was somebody who liked to have a smoke of cannabis now and then. He would do things like hang around the local supermarket to use their free Wi-Fi, and was a fairly well-known face around the area.
It's not clear if Daniel Edwards had any plans or what his future held, but he did seem to have limited horizons.
Daniel's family doesn't seem to have a very high opinion of him either.
He rarely washed and just dumped his clothes in his bedroom every day for his stepmother to clean up.
According to her, the only thing Daniel seemed to care about was his job as a stable hand.
He had been quite upset at losing his job at Grange Farm, looking after those horses. And as the investigation progressed, it was clear that he clearly harboured more of a grudge around losing that job than we initially thought.
This wasn't the first job that Daniel Edwards had lost due to his mental capacities and, due to his learning difficulties. We found out that he'd had 6 or several jobs within that time frame.
And when investigators take a look at Daniel's criminal record, they find something even more disturbing.
He'd been arrested for public drunkenness and assault, amongst other things, but one charge stood out from the rest.
We found that he had had an offence of indecent exposure previously to a woman of a similar age to Fiona Southwell. And that alerted me, was there a sexual element to the offence? Was it revenge?
Coming up, a series of discoveries breaks the case wide open.
The child's vest was similar to those which were used as rags for cleaning.
This was clearly a premeditated attack. He had decided what was going to happen. There is no doubt at all.
Humberside detectives have arrested 21-year-old Daniel Edwards for the brutal murder of Fiona Southwell. But now, the hard work begins.
Within that first 24 to 48 hours of most murder investigations, it can be frenetic, and the pressure on all members of the team is to get it right, and we have to get it right every time.
All signs are pointing towards Edwards as the killer, but can they prove it?
The Humberside police put out an appeal. If anybody had used the old railway tracks and had seen anything suspicious, please to let them know.
Soon after investigators make their public appeal, a woman comes forward with new information.
She explained to us that on the morning of the murder, she had been on the disused railway track, walking her dog, as she usually did. She had seen someone at the relevant time.
She recognised him but could not put a name to his face.
If they can prove it was Daniel, that's a crucial piece of evidence because it completely contradicts everything he told the police.
To verify her testimony, police turned to closed-circuit TV cameras installed in the area.
Luckily, one of the homes nearby had a camera installed, which collected footage of Daniel Edwards walking by, before and after the time of the murder.
Subsequently to that, we then started to find his social media inputs, his phone analysis for text messaging, his geo-tagging and cell site analysis, placing him in the relevant areas at the relevant time.
Now police finally have the evidence they need, and there is more still to come.
The knife found along the railway track hadn't been tied back to Daniel yet, But that changed when investigators conducted a search of Mac's home farm where he worked.
We found missing from that house was a knife from the knife block, which was identified later on as identical to the murder weapon. And within the farm at Mac's home were two young children of the same age that the vest that was recovered related to.
And crucially, the child's vest was similar to those which was used as rags for cleaning at Mac's home farm.
Armed with this new evidence, investigators conduct a second interview with Daniel.
We started to confront him with the evidence that we had found, including the CCTV, his actual movements, as opposed to the movements that he said.
For someone with such a low IQ, it seemed he'd handled himself pretty well. He'd avoided incriminating himself in his initial statement, but obviously that didn't stand up.
What he gave us was a whole lot of truth with a little bit of lie. And that is traditionally what people do. They give some proof areas where we can go and confirm what they're saying is true. So his route to Mac's home was true, his movements and timing was true, but the bit he wasn't truthful about was that on his way home, he went to Grange Farm. He stabbed Fiona Southwell to death, and then he left via the disused railway track all the way back into Hornsey. And he obviously failed to mention that part to us.
However, if police are hoping for a confession, they're sorely disappointed.
Daniel refuses to talk, so police start leaning on him a little harder, taking him through all the evidence they have against him.
The clothing that he was wearing, that we had subsequently recovered from his bedroom, evidential items such as the vest, the blood on the vest, the murder weapon.
That doesn't take them anywhere. Unfortunately, Daniel still refuses to talk.
Still, investigators believe the case against him is strong enough to take to trial.
The police would be very hopeful of getting strong forensic results from both the knife and the vest, and would be anxiously waiting to find out what those were.
We approached the Crown Prosecution Service for a charging decision, which came back that we would be charging Daniel Edwards with the murder of Fiona Southwell, and he would appear before local magistrates the next morning.
On Tuesday, July 19th, just 4 days after the death of Fiona Southwell, Daniel is formally charged with her murder.
There was only me and a couple of other journalists that had actually gone down to Beverley Magistrates Court for the first hearing, and the only people in attendance was Daniel Edwards' father and his stepmom.
Even in court, Daniel remained silent. The only time he said anything was to confirm his name to the judge.
He was just looking forward with a dead man stare. There was nothing there behind them eyes while he was looking. His eyes were just not there.
Daniel doesn't even enter a plea as the judge sends his case to Hull Crown Court.
Daniel finally showed some emotion when the judge told him he wouldn't be granted bail. He didn't seem to care about the murder. The thought of going to prison, that's what brought a tear to his eye.
Coming up, a glimpse into the mind of a disturbed killer.
All of that rage, all of that anger had burst out, a big cathartic explosion.
In January of 2017, the trial of 22-year-old stable hand Daniel Edwards begins. He's accused of stabbing 60-year-old Fiona Southwell to death 6 months earlier, after learning she'd replaced him.
The prosecution described Edwards as somebody who was callous and calculated, prepared to kill an old woman just to get the job back that he felt she'd taken from him and to get rid of his own rage.
The pathologist who conducted Fiona's autopsy testifies to the extreme violence involved in her death.
One knife wound penetrated her brain, another one went straight through her neck. She had a number of other injuries around her body, and indeed it took the Home Office pathologist 50 minutes to go through her injuries in detail.
he was engaged in a frenzy of overkill. He continued to stab her until he felt that rage in him had subsided.
Prosecutors were able to show the jury a wealth of evidence, which included CCTV, phone records, and also text messages that Edwards had sent.
Those messages are used to show Daniel's disturbed state of mind.
He texted a close childhood friend saying that he was on the point of having a nervous breakdown.
And Daniel's social media posts had been a warning as well.
Once we started to dig a little deeper into his social media, there seemed to be a change of mood and a change of mindset within Daniel Edwards, as he had posted peculiar messages and peculiar posts which clearly showed a deterioration of his well-being, and he was having very dark thoughts.
Just 2 weeks before Fiona's murder, there was a series of posts, but one in particular from Daniel was the one where he said he was ready to let his demons come out and play.
We were able to show that he was very bitter around losing his job at Grange Farm, and that he held a grudge significantly against Fiona Southwell, who subsequently was employed.
In addition to his ominous online activity, prosecutors offer cell phone records, which place Daniel at the scene of the crime.
We were able to geographically pinpoint him to certain areas, and through cell site analysis of mobile phone networks, we were able to plot his route to and from and compound the evidence against him.
His phone had activated a mast that could only be accessed from Grange Farm and not at neighbouring Maxholm Farm, where he claimed he'd been that day.
Daniel's own stepmother even testifies against him.
She tells the jury about a conversation she had with Daniel just after the murder. He didn't seem upset at all. He just asked if that meant he could get his job back.
It seems very removed, doesn't it, from emotion? And it belies really his level of social intelligence, and it belies his real connection, actually, to Fiona.
But the most damning evidence of all comes from the results of DNA tests on the blood police collected from him.
They'd taken samples from his clothes, his feet, and from the murder weapon, and they were all matches for Fiona Southwell.
Edwards wasn't found red-handed, but he was found red-ankled. He literally had blood of the victim on his ankle, which is pretty telling.
A week into the trial, Daniel takes the stand in his own defense.
Whatever the prosecutor asked him, the answer was no. Were you angry because you'd been fired? No. Did you resent Fiona for taking your job? No.
Daniel Edwards had no defence. He could not explain any of the evidence against him.
The forensic findings, the blood on his clothing, his movements and the lies that he'd told, it was absolutely clear that he was responsible for the murder.
On February 1st, the jury is sequestered. It doesn't take them long to decide Daniel's fate.
All the evidence was heard. The jury ended up deliberating for just 3 hours before they came back with the verdict.
The jury found Daniel Edwards guilty of Fiona Southwell's murder. He was jailed for life and must serve a minimum of 24 years.
The sentencing judge said that it would have been more, but he did take his learning difficulties into account.
A young man's resentment over losing his job had driven him to commit an unspeakable crime and robbed a community of one of its most beloved members.
This was a dreadful attack on a defenceless lady by a 6-foot-tall, 21-year-old man who had armed himself with a kitchen knife. A cowardly attack by any measure, and Fiona Southwell never stood a chance.
She was only doing her job, the job that she loved. You just think, what horrible person would want to do this to such a nice lady? And that's what kind of sticks with you.
She'd never get to enjoy her golden years as she'd planned to do because somebody had made sure that she wouldn't.
This was a very sad and tragic case. Fiona Southwell was an innocent woman, did not deserve to be killed in such an horrific way.
her perfect match.
She was very well liked in the community and at work. He was like the office stud.
The relationship was progressing. Maybe this is meant to be.
But this office romance wouldn't have a fairy tale ending.
There's bloody handprints on the walls. There's blood smeared on the floor.
The violence was so over the top that it had to have some personal connection.
The ensuing investigation would reveal that Mr. Wright wasn't as perfect as he appeared to be, and someone had decided to make him pay for it.
And I was like, is there a female serial killer? What's going on here?
The person who committed this murder had a score to settle. They chose violence. Bloody violence.
Friday, November 8th, 2002. It's a quiet afternoon in the picturesque harbor area of Stamford, Connecticut. Until 12:13 p.m., when local police receive a disturbing 911 call.
Stamford, please. Hello?
Yes, hello. I think a guy attacked my neighbor. I saw a guy go into her apartment.
The 911 dispatch asks her, what is your neighbor's name? She doesn't know her name, but what she does know is the number of the door.
I don't know her name, but the guy was there in the bathroom. I heard yelling.
Okay. You don't know your... Hello? Hello?
The call cuts off abruptly at that point. They don't know if she hung up, got disconnected, or if she could be in danger as well.
Officers are immediately dispatched to the apartment identified by the caller.
This is a upper-level condominium on the waterfront. They have docks there. It's a very nice neighborhood. So you're not prepared for what you're going to see when you open that door.
They enter the apartment and find the body of a dead woman inside.
The victim was lying just inside the threshold of the door, and there was a tremendous amount of blood. We felt that definitely a stabbing was involved. We could look at the victim, and even without additional information from the medical examiner, you could see a number of stab wounds about the chest and neck area.
The officers quickly secure the area and call for backup.
Considering the location, they knew this was going to be a high-profile case.
When I first got down there, there was a lot of police, and the area was taped off, and it was hard to get information. Police weren't giving anything, but I do remember a source of mine slipping me a note.
By the next morning, the victim's face is all over the news. She is a beautiful 32-year-old research scientist named Annalisa Raimundo.
Annalisa Raimundo was born to Filipino parents who immigrated into this country. Wonderful people. Her father was a doctor. Mother was a professional.
She was just a go-getter, came from a family with very high standards. And I think not only did they want the best for her, but she fought to have the best for herself. Attended Harvard, attended Columbia for graduate school, and just kind of the apple of her parents' eye.
After finishing her degrees, Annalisa could have pursued a career anywhere in the country, but she decided to stay in Connecticut.
She had her pick, and she chose to go into pharmaceutical research, and she was one of the best at her job.
She worked at Purdue Pharma, this big company right downtown Stamford.
She wanted to help people and make the world a better place, but pharmaceuticals are also big business. By her late 20s, she had made enough money to buy herself a condo in Chapon.
She was just climbing the ranks and making a wonderful life for herself.
Annalisa's devotion to her job left little time for relationships, so it wasn't surprising that she fell in love with a coworker.
So while working at Purdue Pharma, she met a man by the name of Nelson Sessler, who worked there as well.
He was tall, handsome, and he was like the office stud, and everybody had a crush on him.
They started out as friends and then began dating casually at first.
But by the summer of 2002, the romance between Annalisa and Nelson had become more serious.
The relationship was progressing. He was spending the night quite a bit at her condo.
Employees definitely knew them as a couple. When there was a work function, they were together. They went out together. They did dinners together.
They're making good money, and everything appeared that it was a good relationship.
For Annalisa, I mean, she really felt like this was going to be her husband, like they were going to get married.
But the couple's plans for the future would never be realized. 32-year-old Annalisa has been found murdered in her waterfront condominium, and the entire community wants to know why. Leading the investigation into this high-pressure case is Captain Richard Conklin.
The minute you enter that apartment, the crime scene is all there. Different items that had been knocked about. One of the more bloody scenes I had ever seen.
One of the first things they want to do is find the 911 caller. She had hung up so abruptly, they had to be thinking the worst, that maybe she was a victim as well.
Someone called 911, and that person who called 911 said they were a neighbor. Who is it? Well, what happens is, when they begin to send out other investigators and start looking at tracing the call, what they find is kind of strange.
When we find that the call came from a payphone about a half mile from this crime scene.
If this caller's life is in danger, it would make sense for her to get away and call from someplace safe. But if she had done so, why didn't she just say that?
They alleged that they were a witness to this disturbance. And, these are the things that were racing through our mind. Why didn't this person identify themselves?
I think there were some red flags that immediately went up at that point.
Immediately, we had to come up to speed very quickly. Who was this victim? What were we dealing with? Who might have done this to her?
Coming up, crime scene investigation reveals clues about the killer.
Stabbing someone is a crime of passion. You have to have some real deep feelings to kill someone that maliciously.
Under intense media scrutiny, Connecticut police have begun an investigation into the murder of 32-year-old research scientist Annalisa Raimundo.
We're knocking on doors, we're doing computerized checks as to that residence. Has there been different disturbance calls there? Have they called for police services prior? All these are going on at one time and very, very rapidly.
Mind you, this is still early in the afternoon on a workday, so many of her neighbors weren't home. The few that were home reported hearing nothing.
The 911 call has been traced to a nearby payphone, but the caller's identity is still unknown.
We send people to process this area. At that time, they didn't have security cameras trained on that outside payphone. It's difficult to get straight up fingerprints off of it because there's so many people handling these payphones back at that point.
Police canvass the other businesses in the area, hoping someone saw the caller, but they come up empty-handed. Meanwhile, a team of forensic specialists is busy processing the condominium for evidence.
I can't really describe how frantic you are in the beginning of a high-level homicide like this and the number of tasks you're undertaking at one time. Soon after seeing this scene, I made a decision, and it's one I've only made a couple times in my entire career. We decided to call in the state police major crime unit. DNA was just starting to be a wonderful tool for law enforcement. And when we saw what a bloody crime scene this was, we really wanted to preserve the scene. And you only get one chance, one shot at processing a crime scene. If you don't do it well, you lose the evidence.
What they would have seen standing from the foyer, basically, is a female victim who appears to be 25 to 35. Long black hair, kind of lying on the ground. There's bloody handprints on the walls, and there's blood smeared on the floor.
There was no forced entry. The lock was in good shape. It hadn't been tampered with. So you have to think that perhaps someone knocked or rang the doorbell and our victim answered the door and then either allowed someone entry or someone kind of pushed their way through at that point. And then it looked like just immediately a life and death struggle took place.
Annalisa's injuries provide a terrifying summary of the attack.
There was a very violent struggle. There was glass broken. Annalisa was smashed over the head with an object and also stabbed several times in the face and neck, chest.
Stabbing someone is a crime of passion. You have to be angry with someone or have some real deep feelings to kill someone that maliciously. And she was stabbed 9 times.
The dumbbell on the ground has hair and it has blood on it. So they know that that dumbbell was used in this crime in some way.
Annalisa's skull had been fractured by a heavy blow, and she had been stabbed a total of 9 times to the face, neck, and chest. One of the stab wounds had even reached the back of her lung. Thankfully, there was no sign of sexual assault.
No, this was a prolonged attack, but whatever edged knife or weapon was used was not left at the scene. We could not locate that in that area.
Further inspection also reveals a trail of blood leading away from the body.
You can see bloody footprints and smudges going all the way to the bathroom. So for investigators, that bathroom becomes a focal point.
There was some blood, a droplet of blood, as they described it, on the sink handle in the bathroom there near the entryway.
We kind of felt that someone might have washed up there because it would be odd, to find that blood on that fixture like that.
Police are hopeful the DNA will help identify Annalisa's killer. But what prompted the attack?
You make some assessments as you're going along. Could someone had attempted to burglarize this location and didn't realize that she was home? As we look through the apartment, there's so many valuables left around. The place isn't ransacked.
There's silverware, there's computers, there's TVs. There's still money in her pocketbook.
I felt that the violence was so over the top that it almost had to have some personal connection to it.
And police quickly learn there is no one closer to Annalisa than her boyfriend, Nelson.
We started contacting friends and family. We were talking to neighbors, and we were able to make that she was in a relationship with Nelson Sessler. So immediately, that's put on our to-do list.
Coming up, a loving boyfriend or a cold-blooded killer?
I've seen people on scenes drop to their knees screaming and crying in disbelief that someone is dead. Why is this guy not completely distraught?
Hours after finding Annalisa Raimundo murdered in her luxury condominium, investigators have a potential suspect. Her boyfriend, Nelson Sessler.
You're looking at domestic partners, especially such a violent crime like this, and you realize that you want to make contact immediately because such a violent, bloody crime scene, there's no way that there wasn't transfer of blood to the attacker.
But before officers can even begin searching for him, Nelson unexpectedly shows up at the crime scene.
Up pulls this guy, and he wants to know what's going on in that condominium. Why do you want to know? That's my girlfriend/fiance in there.
There was, no bloody clothing, no scratch marks on his face.
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They know the killer used the bathroom sink to wash the blood off, so now they're really interested to see what Nelson has to say.
He said they were already engaged or they were about to get engaged, but they were definitely becoming more serious and they were talking about marriage and they had a very good relationship.
They tell him, that his fiancée has been the victim of a homicide, and they were struck by his reaction. It wasn't a typical grief or grieving type of action. It was very emotionless.
If I'm told my fiance was just murdered, I'm going to lose it. Nelson doesn't shed a tear. He kind of bows his head a little bit and sits there, and he's kind of like, oh, geez, golly, I can't believe this happened.
Despite his strange reaction, Nelson denies having anything to do with Annalisa's death.
According to Nelson, the last time he saw her was the morning he was leaving for work. He said they'd made plans to get together again that night.
She moved to another company in New Jersey. She was working from home a lot, traveling back and forth to New Jersey.
He and Annalisa were supposed to go into the city to have drinks with a friend from Purdue Pharma.
While police try to verify Nelson's story, his attitude does little to reduce their suspicions.
They want to keep this guy contained. So they keep him in this lounge. And as they're going through the crime scene, they come back to him. He's sleeping.
This guy was so laid back. Yeah, my girlfriend was just killed, but I'm going to go take a nap.
They ask him for a DNA sample, which he voluntarily gives up, but the way he's acting is sending all kinds of red flags.
But when investigators contact the pharmaceutical company, they confirm his alibi.
The good thing about Purdue Pharma is they have a very extensive security system with cameras and a badge type of check-in.
They were able to look at that time frame when this murder happened and see that Nelson was indeed at work, as he said.
He had a very rock-solid alibi at that point that he was not the killer.
With Nelson no longer a suspect, detectives turn their attention back to the missing female 911 caller.
They asked Nelson if there were any women that he could think of that would want to hurt Annalisa. No one immediately comes to mind, but he does give police the name of two former girlfriends who both suffered from depression.
Investigators quickly rule out both women, as well as the rest of Annalisa's family.
They weren't anywhere near the condo at the time of the murder, and they didn't have a motive, but police did take a DNA sample just in case.
We're doing meticulous work, but we really don't have anything that we're really locked into.
You start to look at, well, what's going on in this area of the condominium? Well, one thing they find out is a lot of the yachts parked near there are burgled. And they start looking at some of the people arrested for those crimes.
Anyone that was arrested in the city of Stamford was being debriefed. Do they know anything about this? There was a great deal of frustration that we weren't making great headway in this investigation.
Detectives' best hope for a lead comes from the DNA tests performed on the blood found in Annalisa's bathroom.
The DNA hit comes back on a mixture of both our victim and another person's DNA. And again, you start looking for elimination, like you look for elimination fingerprints.
They compared that sample to the exemplars they had with everyone they had talked to so far. As suspected, it didn't match Nelson or the victim's family.
They submit that blood into CODIS, into all the systems, but comes up negative. If that person hadn't been arrested before, it's not going to pop up.
It would either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to any suspects that we developed later in this investigation. So it was certainly something we were very happy about and hopeful.
But when months go by without any new developments in the case, those hopes begin to wane.
There is no one left to interview at this point, and they still need more information on this mysterious 911 caller. It's like the investigation just comes to a halt at this point.
You're just waiting for something to come in. It eats you up inside because you want answers for the family. You want justice.
Coming up, news of another stabbing provides investigators with the break they've been looking for.
And I was like, is there a female serial killer? What's going on here?
After 5 months of investigation into the murder of Annalisa Raimundo, Connecticut police seem to have reached a dead end. But on March 23, 2003, an incident in nearby New York changes that.
I remember I came in the office and my editor was saying, you need to look into this. There was a stabbing in Westchester County, and someone called and said they think it's related to Annalise's death.
Westchester Medical Center, Sunday night, some hospital employees were out on their break, and they hear a scuffle in the car park.
It's dark and they can't be sure what they're seeing, but it appears to be a man and a woman who are engaged in a physical altercation.
A security guard intervened, separated the two, and they called the police.
The man was bleeding heavily from 3 stab wounds to the chest. Luckily, they were right outside of an emergency room, and he was able to be treated immediately.
They got the suspect, who was the wife, in, and the Westchester authorities started questioning her. They felt that they had an attempt at murder here.
The victim's name is Paul Christos. His wife is 33-year-old Sheila Davalu. Sheila tells investigators that she and Paul had met as fellow students at New York Medical College in 1994, before getting married in May of 2000.
They were rising up the ranks of their careers in college, getting master's degrees, doctorates, and they were good together.
Sheila claims they have it all wrong. She was trying to help her husband, not hurt him.
What time was it when he came home?
I didn't notice him at first. I was playing with the dog, and then he came and he said he's hurt, and he laid on the floor, and he's like, "Can you look at it, see if it's bleeding?" I saw the wounds in his chest.
So was there blood around his body?
There's definitely a lot of blood.
Sheila claims they decided it would take too long for an ambulance to arrive, so she drove Paul to the hospital.
If she and Paul weren't fighting in the parking lot, then what were they doing when the security guard had to separate them? And why did she take the time to park the car at all?
Sheila, I have to be honest with you. I found it odd.
The whole thing is odd.
Meanwhile, doctors have stabilized Paul's condition. The first thing he does is ask to speak to police.
Paul Christos is a strong guy. I mean, here's a guy who was stabbed 3 times, punctured lung, bled profusely, but he's talking. He wants to tell his story.
Their marriage had not apparently been doing well for a while. They were both academics, but they were kind of living separate lives. He was continuing on with school. She had this career.
Paul says that when he came home earlier that day, Sheila suggested they try something new to reignite their relationship.
He was still trying to work on this marriage, so when he's, hearing, okay, we're going to play a sex game, he's, all in for it.
He describes some game he was playing with his wife, whereby they would blindfold each other and they would rub different objects on each other, and the blindfolded person had to guess what the object was. He describes how he was blindfolded, tied to a chair, and his wife is rubbing objects on him, and all of a sudden he just feels this kind of thrust, this sharp pain in his chest. And he tells her, "Please take the blindfold off. What's going on here?" And he looks down and he sees blood. His wife says, "Oh, it was a candle, and there must have been some piece of metal sticking out of the bottom of the candle, and it cut you or something." He buys that, I guess.
Paul's still in love with Sheila, and I think the fact that he's willing to still believe her despite how badly he's injured is a testament to that.
He's like, "Okay, but I'm kind of losing blood and I'm getting dizzy. Call 911. He's in the chair listening to his wife as she describes, "My husband is hurt, he's bleeding, and we need an ambulance here." They wait.
Paul says they waited for what seemed like a very long time, but the ambulance never showed up.
He begs his wife, "Put me in the car, take me to the ER." He's in the back seat. She pulls into the hospital parking lot and pulls around back. He's like, "What's going on?" She gets out of the car, comes over, opens the passenger door in the back. She has a knife in her hand. She begins to attack him.
She stabs him again, and thank goodness those hospital employees were out there and heard what was going on.
Now he knows something. He knows it wasn't a candle. His wife blindfolded him, strapped him to a chair, and then stabbed him.
Investigators confront Sheila with her husband's testimony, but she denies trying to kill him.
She admits to using a knife in their sex game, but she insists that she never meant to hurt Paul.
How did you put a knife to somebody's chest by accident? I don't know. Paul said you would say it again. On the way to the hospital.
But when detectives search the hospital parking lot, they find two damning pieces of evidence.
They find a bloody kitchen knife and Sheila's cell phone, which she dropped during the struggle. When they search her call history, it's easy to see she's been lying to them.
Sheila Davlu never called 911 for an ambulance. She never dialed the number.
Instead, she called someone else in Stamford, and there were voicemails from that same number in return.
It's a guy who is traveling down to Westchester County in order to meet Sheila that night for dinner and spend the weekend. So it's clear that she has a lover, and that man's name is Nelson Sessler.
Coming up, detectives in New York and Connecticut join forces to solve the murder of Annalisa Raimundo.
I think that he needed a shoulder to cry on, and so she kind of played into that. He was vulnerable.
New York police suspect 33-year-old Sheila Davlu tried to kill her husband and make it look like an accident. But they're about to discover she's also connected to a different stabbing.
She's been arrested and charged in New York at this point, and they know she's been having an affair with a man named Nelson, and they want to find out if he's involved as well.
So an investigator makes the 45-minute drive from Westchester to Stamford.
She heads up to Stamford, Connecticut, knocks on the door to his apartment. No answer. Knocks again. No answer.
A neighbor hears the commotion and comes outside, and they just want to know if they found who murdered Nelson's fiancée yet.
Well, what are you talking about, murder? And so she pieces together right there that there's a murder in Stamford, and now she has a man stabbed in Westchester County, and that somehow these could be connected.
She immediately contacts the detectives investigating Annalisa's murder. Hours later, Nelson Sessler is brought in for more questioning.
Whether he was complicit or not is something we needed to find out. You know, the oddity of this attack, the oddity and the timing of this phone call.
Nelson says all three of them worked at Purdue Pharma together. He briefly dated Sheila before he met Annalisa, but it was pretty casual, and that's why he hadn't mentioned her before.
Sheila and Nelson had started seeing each other in 2001, but the relationship wasn't exclusive.
Nelson, is kind of casually dating Sheila Davlu at this point and starts to casually date Annalisa Raimundo.
Until he got serious with Annalisa, and then that relationship ceased.
Nelson claims he and Sheila had broken things off in 2002. He also admits that for the past 2 months, he had been seeing Sheila again, but claims the affair hadn't begun until 2 months after Annalisa was killed.
He was trying to get over the death of Annalisa, and I think that he needed a shoulder to cry on, and so she kind of played into that.
Nelson said that Sheila had reached out to him with a care package full of cookies and things like that. Then the next weekend, she invited him on a ski trip with some friends from work, but when he got there, it was just the two of them.
Either he's really gullible or she's really smart. Maybe a little bit of both, but he, fell right into her trap and kind of rekindled their relationship.
Nelson also claims he had no idea Sheila was married.
She worked at Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut. The one thing Sheila didn't mention at Purdue Pharma was that she had a husband in Westchester County. She never told anyone about that.
Nelson told police he had slept over her house several times, but he never saw any signs of anyone else living there.
When investigators follow up with Sheila's husband, they find out why.
He goes into a lengthy story about her having supposedly a disabled brother. who would come and visit for the weekend.
Sheila says, if my brother finds out I'm married to you, he's going to get really upset. He's very possessive that way. Paul felt sorry for her and for him.
It's hard to believe, but he would clean out anything that would link him to the apartment. Any pictures, clothes. He would go and stay with friends or in a hotel.
Sheila would then have Nelson Sessler come over and sleep with him all weekend while Paul was at a hotel.
In retrospect, it's easy for Paul to see his wife's deception, but he says it didn't stop there.
Sheila, she had this whole story that she would tell Paul all the time, about her friends at work, Melissa and Jack and Lisa, and how it was a love triangle. She'd go home at night at the end of the day and say to Paul, I feel so bad for my friend Melissa. How can I help her? She's really put out. She's really heartbroken because Jack is interested in this other woman. What do I do?
Paul at one point had an interest in becoming an FBI agent. He had had some training and even some law enforcement equipment like night vision goggles. He gave them to Sheila so she could help her friend. Of course, there is no friend. The relationship she's worried about is the one between Nelson and Annalisa.
And it was at that time, really, when Sheila Davalu began stalking Nelson, using night vision goggles, following him.
Once this came into focus, the level of obsession that Sheila had with Nelson and the different means that she would pursue him, it really became apparent that she wanted to take out the competition.
When you look back at it, it's absolutely frightening.
Nelson has already been cleared of any involvement in Annalisa's murder, and it's now clear to Stamford police that Sheila had plenty of motive to kill Annalisa. But did she have the opportunity?
We know Purdue Pharma has a wonderful security system and that she worked there on that day. Was she working at this time?
What we see is Sheila Davalu taking a long lunch on the day that Annalisa Raimondo was murdered. And during the time that the 911 call's made. So here's the opportunity.
We played the call for so many of her family and associates, and there were a number of them that said, that's absolutely Sheila.
The only thing left is to tie her to the crime scene, and that's where the DNA comes in. They already have samples from Annalisa's apartment, and if Sheila is a match, that's pretty much ball game.
The lab results come back with a conclusive match for Sheila's DNA. Now, in addition to the attempted murder of her husband, she is also charged with the murder of Annalisa Raimondo. Coming up, Sheila puts her defense in the hands of the only person she trusts, herself.
She believes these grandiose thoughts of herself that I can talk my way out of this. Everybody's going to believe me.
In February of 2004, Sheila Davalu faces trial in New York for the attempted murder of her husband, Paul Christos.
Prosecutors not only have the weapon and the eyewitnesses at the hospital, they also have Paul's direct testimony.
Paul was a very good witness. He was very forthcoming. The attack at the hospital kind of locked into his mind that this was an attempt on his life.
He had these loving feelings for her, so it was very upsetting for him to know that the woman he married tried to kill him.
The jury was sympathetic towards Paul, and the evidence was very strong. Sheila was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Sheila serves nearly 10 years of her sentence before she is finally tried for the murder of Annalisa Raimondo.
There's no statute of limitations on homicide or murder, so we had all the time in the world.
Sheila's second trial begins on January 24th, 2012. Connecticut prosecutors argue that Sheila murdered Annalisa for the same reason she tried to kill her husband.
It was all about her obsession with Nelson Sessler. She wanted him more than anything, but the feeling was not mutual.
I think Sheila saw it as a relationship, whereas Nelson saw it as someone to sleep with.
The jealous rage comes into play. We spoke about the overkill on the assault, the number of stab wounds, the bludgeoning.
In addition to her husband's testimony, the state also has strong evidence to support their case.
If Sheila Davalu didn't murder Annalisa Raimondo, why is her blood in Annalisa Raimondo's condominium? And that 911 call comes back up.
Sheila definitely attempted to disguise her voice in that call. As years went on, and we had the luxury of time in this case, the technology exploded in voice recognition, and we had experts again look into it, and they say, yes, that's definitely her voice.
So, the question always asked is, why did Sheila Davalu call 911 and not just go back to work? She's an ultimate narcissist. She cannot help herself from thinking that she can put the pawns in place to get away with something.
When the time comes for Sheila's defense, she surprises everyone by deciding to represent herself.
For as smart as this woman is, and the time she had spent studying, she just kind of fell flat on her face with the cross-examination. She seemed nervous. She seemed at many times like she didn't know where to go next with the questioning. The judge was very often frustrated with the situation, overrule what she was saying.
Her only hope was to try and discredit the evidence against her. She asked the jury if they thought her voice sounded anything like the one on the 911 tape. She also called the DNA results into question.
She felt that it was a mistake, or perhaps something that, we had orchestrated.
She also tried to use the New York conviction as proof she was incapable of committing murder. If she was the one to kill Annalisa, then it stood to reason that she would have been able to finish the job with her own husband, especially since he was tied up and blindfolded.
With Annalisa, there was rage. She went to her house, got in, there was a big struggle. I think with Paul, it was like, she had these mixed feelings. She was stabbing him, but yet she was helping him. She was stabbing him, but yet she was putting him in the car and taking him to the hospital.
On February 10th, 2012, the jury announces their verdict.
Sheila was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to an additional 50 years in prison.
To hear that verdict and just a sense of relief and, really feeling good for the family that, in a bad situation, we had given them some amount of closure here. We had ascertained the truth in this investigation.
A scorned lover's need for revenge had torn apart several lives and ended the future of a promising young woman.
I have this vision in my head of either the doorbell or a knock at the door, and Annalisa looking through the peephole and seeing Sheila Davalu and kind of being quizzical, like, oh, that's odd, but recognize her and really feeling no threat.
That's the sad part, that she opened the door for someone that she thought was a friend or, someone that she knew, and let them into her home.
Sheila Davalu is really the ultimate narcissist. Still to this day, she'll tell you I had nothing to do with it. She even says, I will pray for Annalisa and her family. She's going to pray for the woman she murdered. That's a sociopath, and that's Sheila Davalu.